please, let this work. That's all I've been thinking about lately when it comes to Nintendo. I think it's fair to say we've been biding our time with the company over the past year. The Switch is clearly at the end of its life cycle, and reports and rumors of when Nintendo will finally announce its next console seem to drop weekly. And the last few Direct presentations have all but confirmed the company is moving on. When a Direct's biggest headlines are a Princess Peach game and a console port of Luigi's Mansion 2, you know the well has truly run dry. But then Nintendo decided to throw us a curveball last September, announcing a remake of Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door 20 years after it first released on the GameCube. The announcement came just 2 months ahead of the release of the Super Mario RPG remake, and then just a couple of weeks ago, Nintendo quietly sent out a fan survey centered around The Thousand-Year Door. It feels like Nintendo is up to something, and for the first time in over 15 years, I finally have a reason to hope for one of my favorite gaming franchises of all time. As a kid growing up in the 90s, my earliest video game memories centered around Mario. One of the first games I ever played was the Super Mario Bros. Duck Hunt double cartridge on my cousin's old Super Nintendo. My first memory of going over to a friend's house to watch them play a game was with Super Mario World. And one of the first games I ever beat was Super Mario Land 2, which I then proceeded to beat at least a dozen more times. When my brother and I got a Nintendo 64 for Christmas one year, it came with 2 games, Super Mario 64 and Mario Kart. And as the years passed, if I ever got my hands on a Nintendo console or handheld, one of my first purchases would be a Mario game, even if it was just ports of older titles. And I know that's the same story for so many gamers out there. It doesn't matter if you're a big-time Twitch streamer or someone who only gets to put in a couple of hours on the latest Call of Duty or Madden on the weekends. If you went back and looked through all the games you've played in your life, a Mario game is somewhere in there, and there's probably more than one. Now, if you were into gaming in the late 90s and 2000s, you remember the massive jumps in technology on an almost yearly basis. Nowadays, the jump in graphics from the PS4 to the PS5 isn't always immediately noticeable. But compare games from 1998 to 2008. They don't even look like they're from the same planet. And as gaming evolved, it opened the door to tell more thought-provoking, in-depth stories. A developer didn't have to choose between great gameplay, graphics, and narrative. It could have all three. But while Nintendo was right alongside Sony and Microsoft in having these big technological leaps, it quickly became clear that storytelling was often a secondary focus to a game's mechanics. It wasn't always the case, just look at Zelda and Metroid. But when it came to Mario, it felt like Shigeru Miyamoto and co. never wanted the world of the Mushroom Kingdom to evolve narratively. They'd tinker with things like cutscenes and even voice acting, but the big console titles and handheld installments always kept things simple. Bowser has kidnapped somebody, Mario needs to save them, and the setting is merely a backdrop for whatever game mechanics developers have made this time around. It's why I wasn't shocked that the common criticism for last year's Mario movie was that its story felt shallow and rushed. It was, quite literally, a faithful adaptation of the games. But back in 2000, Nintendo and Intelligent Systems dropped a game that shook up the formula, Paper Mario. Suddenly, the Mushroom Kingdom was an entire world to explore, and not just levels to jump your way through. It was full of unique characters, many of whom fought right alongside you. Toads and Koopas weren't just background characters and enemies, they had developed entire communities, each with their own catchy theme music. Sure, Peach still gets kidnapped and Bowser is the final boss again, but it all felt so creative and had a witty sense of humor to it, completely different from anything else Mario was doing in either 2 or 3D. As a 7-year-old, with no knowledge of Super Mario RPG, this blew my underdeveloped mind. And then 4 years later, Nintendo said, oh, you thought that was cool? Here's an even better sequel where you join a pro wrestling federation, solve a mystery on a train, and fight our take on the Galactic Empire from Star Wars. Even though I could never beat The Thousand-Year Door as a kid, its spot on my all-time favorite games list is carved in stone. Then 3 years later, just as Nintendo was waist-deep in motion controls thanks to the staggering success of the Wii, we got our third Paper Mario installment, Super Paper Mario. And while it did away with plenty of the RPG mechanics from the first 2 games, it gave us by far the craziest story ever seen in a Mario game. You watch an entire world vanish into a black hole. You find out Luigi has been masking his insecurities in the most toxic way possible. Mario dies and goes to the underworld. It's not subtle. And while it's the first game in the series that some would consider divisive, I still think it's a worthy final installment in this initial trilogy. Unfortunately, if you're a fan of this franchise, you know where this story goes next. In the early 2010s, I went off to college and had neither the money nor time for most video games. But I did keep tabs on the industry through news websites like IGN and critics like Yahtzee Croshaw. By the way, follow and donate to the folks over at Second Wind. They're doing great work right now. And it was during this time I watched Paper Mario go from a near universally praised Nintendo franchise to one of its most controversial. Since 2012, there have been 3 official Paper Mario titles. One that is universally blamed for the franchise's downturn, a slight improvement, and one that holds the distinction of being okay. Each game has its own flaws, but they universally lack the creativity and storytelling depth that made the original trilogy shine. Add on the decision to replace the original combat system with new systems that outright punish you for taking part in them, and you've got 3 games that can't get within shouting distance of the franchise's glory days. The frustration and debate surrounding the changes from the past 3 games have come to define a big portion of the Paper Mario fandom, and attempts to explain Nintendo's decisions for those changes have created a YouTube rabbit hole that is somehow as deep as it is hilariously specific. Having dug through interviews, news articles, over a dozen videos on the subject, and all of Arlo's coverage on the franchise over the years, I've managed to compile the cliff notes on what happened. But keep in mind, Nintendo is a Japanese company that can be very protective with its creative processes, so I'm working with what's public record. The big changes in the franchise's overall design philosophy happened while Sticker Star was in development, and were caused by 4 major factors. Number 1, Nintendo put out a survey to its Club Nintendo members after the release of Super Paper Mario. According to Kensuke Tanabe, who has been with the franchise since Thousand Year Door and has been the producer of the last 3 installments, only 1% of fans surveyed thought the story was interesting. Number 2, Miyamoto pushed for developers to scrap the emphasis on story, believing Sticker Star would be fine without one. Number 3, despite developers stating in interviews at the time of Super Paper Mario's release that the franchise wouldn't go back to the standard RPG format, Miyamoto apparently criticized the early build of Sticker Star for being too similar to Thousand Year Door. And number 4, Miyamoto also pushed for the game to only use characters, quote, from the Super Mario world. Tanabe would later confirm in an interview with VGC in 2020 that, ever since the development of Sticker Star, developers working on Nintendo games are no longer allowed to modify Mario characters or create original characters directly tied to the Mario universe. This has since been labeled as the Mario Mandate within the fan community, and while there have been notable exceptions, the mandate seems focused on spin-off Mario titles. Why Nintendo decided to start this mandate is something of a mystery. The Wikipedia page that chronicles Paper Mario's history as a franchise claims Miyamoto created it once he was no longer the series' producer. But A, the interview that passage links to doesn't confirm that, and B, Miyamoto wasn't credited as the producer on Super, so why wasn't the mandate around back then? There's speculation out there that Super went so far off the deep end that Nintendo had to overcorrect and enforce new rules, but nobody has gone on record confirming that. Going back through developer interviews, you get the sense they legitimately want to innovate and create new ideas with each installment. And that's fine, it happened with Super. But those 4 factors I mentioned above are why there's a certain hollowness to these last 3 games. Sticker Star was initially well received by critics and sold well, better than the beloved first 2 games even. But fan backlash quickly followed, and it's now the whipping boy of the series, blamed for so much of why the franchise has veered off in its current direction. The developers claimed to listen to some of that criticism while making its next game, Color Splash, but between all the bad PR surrounding it looking and playing like Sticker Star and its release on the Wii U, it's the worst-selling game in the franchise by a decent margin. Then in 2020, while everyone was stuck in lockdown, we got the latest original title, Paper Mario: The Origami King. And there was real hype surrounding the game when the initial trailer dropped, because it looked like the storytelling and RPG elements were back. But combat turned out to be more like puzzle solving, and while the story had its moments, you could see how it was still shackled by the limitations Nintendo had placed on the developers. It was less a positive step forward and more an awkward stumble in the right direction, but it sold well and has its defenders. So here you have a franchise that, despite heavy vocal criticism from online fans, was overall doing better sales numbers while managing to walk the tightrope of changing things up for each game while obeying the company-mandated creative restrictions. But if you go back and watch videos of fans talking about the franchise, you'll notice the consistent tone goes from outrage over the drop in quality to a feeling of helpless resignation. Because it wasn't just Miyamoto, Tanabe, and the folks at Intelligent Systems responsible for Paper Mario's new direction. It was also caused by another Mario spin-off series. But to explain that, we need to jump back a few decades. The year is 1994. Miyamoto wants to try his hand at creating a Mario RPG, and Japanese developer Square wants to make an RPG that actually has a chance of selling well outside of Japan. With their powers combined, they created Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars, which arrived in 1996 on the Super Nintendo months before the release of the Nintendo 64. Despite arriving at the absolute tail end of that console generation, the game was widely praised at the time, and is now considered both an all-time classic and a major influence on the Mario franchise. This was the first time we got to see many of the Mario characters show actual personalities. Heck, this is where Bowser's entire characterization came from. Without this game, we don't get Jack Black in the movie, and that means no Peaches, 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 which would truly be a loss for mankind. And as a kid, I completely missed out on this game. I never owned a Super Nintendo, and my only memory of it was seeing the game's case at a friend's house long after the 64 had come out. I'm pretty sure my reaction was, what the heck is this, and what's wrong with Bowser's face? But while Mario RPG was a critical success, it never got an outright sequel. Nintendo started planning for one, but Square's decision to sign with Sony for the development and release of Final Fantasy VII caused the company to look elsewhere. Eventually, they'd tap Intelligent Systems to create the new game, making the first Paper Mario as a spiritual successor to Super Mario RPG. But it wasn't the only one. The same year Paper Mario hit shelves, Mario RPG's director Chihiro Fujioka founded a new development company called Alpha Dream. In 2003, it released its own spiritual successor to Mario RPG with Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga, complete with RPG's co-director Yoshihiko Maekawa as the handheld game's director. Much like Paper Mario, it had an anarchic sense of humor, introduced a boatload of new characters, had a unique story, and centered around turn-based combat. If you play Mario RPG followed by the early titles in both series, you can immediately see where each picked which elements to adapt, but they stood out enough to where you'd never confuse the two. Personally, I played the hell out of the first two Mario & Luigi games, and Bowser's Inside Story wound up being the most commercially successful of the series. But just like with Paper Mario, things took a turn once the 2010s arrived. In an interview with GameXplain at E3 2016, Risa Tabata, a producer on both Color Splash and Origami King, explained that because Mario & Luigi consistently stuck with the RPG format, it freed up Paper Mario to go off in different directions. Now, on the surface, this isn't a bad answer. For the fans that want that classic Paper Mario experience, there's another line of Mario games that deliver on what they're looking for. But the solution had one big problem. From 2003 to 2015, 5 Mario & Luigi games were released, the last of which, Paper Jam, was a crossover with Paper Mario. But after Paper Jam brought in the worst reviews and sales numbers in the series' history, at the time, Alpha Dream opted to release remastered versions of Superstar Saga and Bowser's Inside Story on the 3DS. But neither sold more than 1 million units, and the latter was so poorly received in Japan, it became one of the lowest-selling Mario titles of all time. That game released stateside at the start of 2019, but by the end of that year, Alpha Dream filed for bankruptcy. There's been no sign of the Mario & Luigi franchise ever since. So now imagine you're a fan of Mario RPG games. The game that started it all seems to be locked away forever due to the rights being split between 2 different companies. Its main spiritual successor has actively veered away from what made its original games so beloved due to corporate mandates and the will of its developers. And when asked if they'll ever go back to the format and style of those original games, they tell you to go play a different Mario series that hasn't seen a new release since 2015 and whose developers have been gone since 2019. It's why when I look at so many videos of fans talking about Paper Mario after the release of Origami King, there's a sense of helplessness. These fans have thrown their hands up and said, this is what Nintendo is giving us, whether we like it or not. The days of Mario games having any real story and world building were over. Or were they? Out of freaking nowhere, Nintendo announced a full-on remake of the original Super Mario RPG during a Direct in June 2023. The game was made by Japanese developer Arte Piazza, and while it was the company's first crack in a Mario game, the production team had people with plenty of credits from the Mario & Luigi series. Fans went from thinking a remake like this was impossible to it being in their hands in just 5 months. And even though I had never played the original, I was 10 minutes into this game before hitting pause and saying to nobody in particular, God, I've missed this. It's every bit as creative as people have said over the years. The writing is hilarious, the villains are memorable, Gino and Malo are outstanding characters, and the turn-based combat is a blast. I breezed through the game and all of its bonus challenges in just 12 hours, but it didn't matter. I had been waiting years for a game like this, and here it was. And it didn't just get good reviews, it sold more than 3 million copies by the end of 2023. That's more than any of these games, and in less than 2 months. So as of this writing, we're 1 month out from the Thousand Year Door remake getting released on the Nintendo Switch. Between it, the Mario RPG remake, and now this online survey, the attitude surrounding the fandom has changed once again. Instead of resignation, there's actual hope. If you've been a Nintendo fan for any length of time, you know trying to make sense of their decisions can sometimes feel impossible. But if you look at what they've been doing lately, it seems like they're actually opening the door for future Mario RPG titles, whether they be a return to form for Paper Mario or something completely new. Instead of plugging their ears and trying to drown out the criticism, the company is legitimately asking fans if this is really what they want. Which brings me back to my original point. Let this work. Let the Thousand Year Door sell well. Let it double the sales of the original game. Let it beat the sales of the last few titles. Let this change the minds of Nintendo higher-ups. Let fans' voices be heard. Let writers and developers start telling stories with Mario again. Please, let this work. Thanks for watching.